Hello, welcome to Real Mindful. This is where we speak mindfully about things that matter. We meet here twice a month to introduce you to some of the teachers, thinkers, writers, and researchers who are engaged in the mindfulness movement. You'll hear all kinds of conversations here about the science of mindfulness, the practice of mindfulness, and the heart of it. I'm Stephanie Domet. I'm the managing editor at Mindful Magazine and mindful.org, and this is Real Mindful. Rhonda Magee is a professor of law at the University of San Francisco. Also trained in sociology and mindfulness-based stress reduction, she's a highly practiced facilitator of trauma-sensitive, restorative MBSR interventions for lawyers and law students, and for minimizing the effects of social identity-based bias. Magee has been a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Law and Society and a visiting professor of law at the University of California, Berkeley. Her book, The Inner Work of Racial Justice, has just been released in paperback by Penguin Random House. The Inner Work of Racial Justice is a rewarding, vital, and timely journey into using contemplative practices to peer into and beyond our biases, according to our founding editor, Barry Boyce, who reviewed the book for Mindful when it was first released in the fall of 2019. Soon after, we ran an excerpt from The Inner Work of Racial Justice, in which Rhonda writes about working through a difficult conversation with a student, and I'll read you a bit of that excerpt. Talking about race isn't easy for anyone, and teaching about race can be a minefield. One of my own most difficult moments teaching about race happened when I encountered intentionally provocative behavior from one of my students, Dan, an Asian American cisgendered man. Dan was in his last semester of law school, and this was his third course with me. It was a course on contemporary issues of law and race. A major component of the course was a research paper, and the students each took turns discussing their thoughts on their projects. When we came to Dan, he said, "I want to do a paper on the Rodney King beating." His likely thesis, he announced, was that the beating King received at the hands of police was deserved. Even as I write this now, I can feel a blip of reactivity. I can see the policemen in that grainy video that we've all seen, appearing to let loose with as much force as they could muster on Mr. King, raining strikes with their batons on the head and torso of a man already on the ground beneath them. And I can feel the empathetic pain, sadness, and anger coming up for me as a result. So when Dan made this announcement to our small seminar-style class sitting around an oblong table, I could sense the tense silence that fell across the whole room, and I could feel my mouth go dry with fear and a bit of intimidation. I felt my temperature involuntarily rise, the blood seemingly rushing to my head. This is what anger feels like, I knew enough to admit to myself silently. And I certainly felt viscerally and immediately the sense of energy of judgmental thoughts arising in my own mind. You are wrong. And indignation, how dare you? This was what confusion, anger, and dismay all mixed up together felt like, and it was what deep concern and compassion for my other students felt like. Several of them were Black and brown and had felt the direct impact of nationwide patterns of over-policing of Black men. Finally, on top of all of this, my own ego was on the line. I'd been tasked with facilitating this conversation and guiding it productively, and this moment certainly wasn't feeling like success. So, you can read the rest of that excerpt at mindful.org. We'll link to it in our show notes. And Rhonda details in it how she worked through a series of conversations with Dan, uncovering what was motivating him and helping him work through some of his own trauma and arrive at some healing. It's a really powerful excerpt, but it left me with a lot of questions as a reader. So I connected with Rhonda Magee in late 2019 to ask her some of those questions. And here's our conversation. In this excerpt from your book, you detail the steps that you took to help one of your students kind of process his feelings, attitudes, and biases. And you detail, that it was a lengthy process. Can you talk about the kind of energy that work requires?
Yes, thank you so much. So the kinds of energy, I'm thinking of different ways of answering that. So on one level, you could say in terms of quantity, it requires a lot. you know. It requires a certain kind of commitment, a certain willingness to turn toward that which we could so easily deflect, turn away from, deny, minimize, avoid. Okay, we've got a lot of, let's say, how do I put this? I feel we have a lot of support in most of our communities, in many cultures, for turning away from difficulty. And certainly when we're in institutional settings with other objectives that we could point to as a justification for avoiding these issues. There are many ways in which we often find ourselves doing so, avoiding turning toward these issues. So the energy that it takes is, at least in part, I think for me, what comes up is the fact that it's really important to decide that when these opportunities present themselves for us to, to really look into what's arising around all of this, we will take them up. We will turn into that opportunity as opposed to away from it. So that's a kind of energy it takes. I also think it takes a kind of grounding in a certain kind of, I'm going to use the word love here. A certain kind of, we could use the word kindness. We could use the word loving kindness, but essentially, for me, it takes some feeling of the value, of the possibility of connecting across lots of difference, and of the importance and value of trying to do so again and again, even when it's difficult. So so those are two ways I think about the kinds of energy that are necessary. Number one, it takes a fair amount. Number two, it takes a kind of energy that's wrapped in kindness, love, compassion that includes ourselves, even as we seek to extend it toward others. And both of these then imply a certain amount of, let's say, work, kind of rolling up our sleeves and engaging in these aspects of our lives, these interactions, these opportunities to connect with a certain will to stay in it over the long term as well, or as long as might be required and might be possible in the effort to create some possibilities for healing, for peacemaking, for doing justice that we can feel in our communities. Well, those are some thoughts.
Why is it worth it to you to do that work, especially on that one-to-one level?
Why is it worth it?
Yeah.
Well, in my view, absolutely everything is connected. And that means all of us are connected. And so it seems to me that when we have these opportunities to expand the sense of our common ground, and we don't take advantage of them, and we don't do what we can to heal, repair, and transform the world, to use the language of kind of tikkun olam that comes out of the Jewish tradition, right? But if we don't take advantage of these opportunities to bridge difference, then it seems to me we are, in effect, contributing to distance and contributing to barriers and obstacles to deep well-being. I don't know. For me, it is about practice. This isn't about actually politics, frankly. It's about, and by politics, I mean like a power struggle or kind of a way of making myself, sort of maximizing some experience for myself alone for some, ego-based sense of what life is about. It is grounded in, in awareness of our fundamental interconnectedness, of the call that seems to arise out of that for me, which is always about minimizing harm as best we can. And so for me, minimizing or working to dismantle the barriers to the awareness of our fundamental interconnectedness, that to me just seems like what we should be doing if we're practicing deeply. It just seems like it just naturally arises out of deep practice for me. Even as I realize this is not necessarily so for everybody who practices. For me, it just seems like to arise out of the deep ethical ground of my practice.
Oh, that's so interesting. So I didn't plan to ask this, but who does it serve, if I can ask it that way? I mean, are you doing it for yourself? Are you doing it for the other person, for the kind of greater good of society, or just to honor the practice? Like, what is that part about?
To me, it serves life, which is, the gift of literally being alive. To me, that's not about any one of us, actually. I mean, fundamentally, proceeding from a place of what in Buddhism is called right view, right? And all of the different dimensions of the Eightfold Path and the Middle Way, which is, the deeper foundations of mindfulness for me. This is just an effort to put language around something that's actually probably beyond words. Right. But really, there is the sense that, to be alive is a great gift. And therefore, the only real response to such a gift is gratitude. And a way to show gratitude is to try to minimize harm wherever it arises as best we can. Recognizing we're not perfect, recognizing that, we're not all, we're not always able to see clearly how what we're doing minimizes or contributes to harm. And, we're all vulnerable in our own ways and misguided in our own ways, right? So it's with a lot of humility that I say this. but ultimately, I think if to answer this question, I mean, it's for me, I do think this question of who does it benefit, to me, it benefits life. I think there's a lot of deludedness about what it means to kind of be in socially engaged, right? There's a lot of efforting around self, around competition, around achievement, which seems very personal, around creating well-being that seems very personal, and then expanding to a limited circle of our concern, our familiars, our loved ones. And all of that makes sense. And it seems the more we really truly understand ourselves to be gifted with life on a planet we didn't create, shot through with all sorts of mysteries, and sharing resources all the time, then it just seems that the only right response to that is to, as best we can, try to minimize deludedness about, the predicament we're in. And to me, a lot of delusions about that predicament show up in identity and in the sense of, the sense we have of our limited capacity to work together, to thrive together, the sense we have of limited resources and not enough. So it seems to me that, if there's a way that as I'm going about my day and engaging with others, I can do some little thing often. Maybe it's just a little thing. Maybe it's just saying hello to somebody that I, based on whatever type of training of the moment I'm not supposed to recognize or appreciate or value, to disrupt some of those teachings, which I feel are kind of in our culture and in the air all the time.
Right. We're all just soaking in that all the time, right? Who our people are and who they're not, and who you're supposed to have some fellow feeling with, and all that. Yeah. Exactly.
Who we're supposed to respect or value, what types of contributions. There's so many of those types of training. If we can counteract them in ways great and small, it just seems like the least we can try to do.
Love this. So I do love this, and it sounds very natural when you talk about how you do it and why you do it. But however, sort of, for a racialized person, for a racialized woman, microaggressions are everywhere, let alone the macroaggressions, the system we live under. There's, kind of endless opportunity, I guess, for you to practice. And that is work. And I wonder how you take care of yourself to ensure that you can do this work that you want to do, feel called to do.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, I believe that, and I write about this, I do think it does require, and for me it has required, or kind of come out of a sense of my own agency and what I often call personal justice. This idea that justice starts with us, like how we treat ourselves is an important part of all of it. And so for that reason, taking care of myself feels like the first approximation of whatever it is I'm trying to offer in the world. So there's a reason I live in San Francisco as opposed to North Carolina or Virginia, where I was born and raised, where, frankly, for me, the environment, right, in San Francisco seems to be a bit more conducive to this way of accepting people, this way of working, cross-culturally, multiculturally, working with people who have different ways of expressing themselves, and whether it be about race, sex orientation, religion, immigration status. I live entirely in this city, right? And so that's putting myself in a kind of an environment that is not an easy one still, right? There's still microaggressions. There's still all the isms and schisms. They're here. They are no question they're here. And, I'm giving myself, by choosing to live here, a little bit of an environmental kind of support for what I'm trying to do.
Right.
And that's just one example. So I think at every point where I have had a chance to choose, the kind of career, kind of work that I do, right? So going into law and then going into law teaching, where there is, for example, again, not that this is a space where we don't have these things come up, but there's a little bit more commitment to democratic, small d, institutional support. So your voice matters in a certain kind of way. And we try to make real our values in a certain kind of way. So for me, it's grounded in an awareness that these sorts of structural environmental aspects of how we live are a part of what might be possible. And then, of course, within that, personal practices like my own commitment to meditation, my own commitment to living the Dharma and being in practice communities with others. But I specifically talked about the environment first and then the practices, because just to sort of play with the way we tend to think about this. We tend to think, we from the place of practice can just kind of overcome just about everything. And that's a good way to think. And certainly, I probably teach that in some ways too. And I don't want to miss this opportunity to name the relevance of our embeddedness in the world.
Right.
And what really is possible is, in some measure, aided and abetted and shaped by the circumstances, the environments, the structures and systems that we find ourselves bathing in all the time.
Right.
So if we have some choice, there's certain things we have choice over and certain things we don't. But if we have some choice to put ourselves in relationships, in workplaces, in locations in the world where we're less likely to, on an everyday basis, be disrespected, be disregarded, then it's a privilege. I'm going to say it's a privilege to be able to have such choices. But if we do, and we recognize those privileges, to me, that's another aid for them being able to offer support to others. Right. It's like I've managed to sort of put myself in a place where I have relationships of support, friends and loved ones. I live in a community that is not, provides a certain kind of buffer, if you will, against some of the worst kinds of disrespect that a person like me might find out in the world. So from this place of some relative protectedness from some of the worst of what could come my way, then I actually am able, I think, to give even more. I mean, to me, that goes back to your other question. Why do this? Who does it serve? It's like, again, it feels like an ethical response to the good fortune that I've managed to find myself in at this point.
/ put together for yourself.
/ put together for myself. Yes, that is true. It is. And it's hard, sometimes I do think for me, there's a certain way in which I have some humility around the I part of it.
Sure.
Right. I mean, and so it's a practice point for me to recognize certainly, the circumstances I find myself in right now are a function of both my own personal efforts and actions and taking advantage of certain opportunities and that agency that I spoke of before. And at the same time, I'm very aware that the mere fact that we take advantage or try to take advantage of opportunities and exercise agency doesn't necessarily mean we will always end up in positions that afford us some protection and buffer against, what can come at us in life, deep suffering in life. Yeah. So while I think it's really important for us, and I do this kind of teaching work as much as possible from this place of helping support the development and cultivation of the sense of like, yes, I can. Yes, this life is for me too. I can make the most of it. I worry sometimes about the extent to which that kind of hyper individualized is all about the effort message, which runs, of course, through Western and many other cultures these days. I just worry about contributing to what I think is another kind of delusion that suggests it's all about our personal effort.
Right. Because that there aren't those big systems and structures that, have much more to do with where you're going to get to
Precisely.
than your own personal effort or merit or any of that.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be here if a whole generation and a generation before that and a generation before that, many generations of people hadn't fought for opportunities for people like me.
That's right.
Period. So we have to keep fighting for opportunities for people who today are suffering from a new set of oppressive systems. And that's another reason why I do this work.
I love it. I was really struck in the interaction that is in the excerpt that we're running of the patience and the compassion and the kindness and the amount of time that you spent with that student. And that's not an approach that everyone would choose, or even an approach that might feel available or preferred to everyone. And I'm thinking about the kind of call out culture and cancel culture that we're in. And I wonder about your take on that. Like, is there a value in those approaches too? Because your approach is so one-on-one, which feels righteous, but slow.
Yeah.
And the kind of call out culture or cancel culture, has kind of a big impact. And I wonder what you see in that. Does that also move the ball down the field somehow?
Thank you for asking that one. Again, from my perspective, it's all here. To act with wisdom may require a range of different ways of responding to what is. So for me, mindfulness, or this kind of middle way, if you will, is about, grounding in a sense of awareness of the temptations, right? The many different kinds of baits there are toward greed, hatred, and delusion, and, all kinds of ways we get caught. So, but it is about acting as responsibly as I can in light of all of that. And so what is called for may vary, will probably vary. What's called for in a particular context, place, and time, right?
Yeah.
The question of how to meet a moment with skillfulness and, whatever approximation toward equanimity is available to us at that moment. So again, to say what's called for is something that, can't fully be predicted in advance. And I don't think that there's only one way, but I definitely think a slow approach has to be part of the toolbox.
Right.
It just, let's just take a look at our history as a guide. Let's listen to the wise teachers across the millennia as guides. Whether, again, I just alluded to the movement, let's call it the freedom movement, through which you and I together and separately are able to have this conversation in the context of work and engagement in the world. The movements that led to women's liberation, more liberation for people of color, an international awareness of, the call to human dignity that we call human rights for all of these movements. They're really, you could see them as separate movements, or you could see them as kind of part and parcel of an effort that's always around us and within us, and not always on the ascendance, not always winning. But if you look around, there's always somebody who's trying to create more opportunity and liberation for others. But it often takes a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of effort. And so yes, there's a role to play, obviously, for kind of a deep, slow willingness to be a part of whatever solutions might emerge, and to be a healing agent, if you can, right? To bring together those points of separation and communities that are separated and viewpoints that seem separated, right? To be searching for common humanity. There's always some role to play for that. But it's not the only thing, the only way. And so while I think we've probably in the social justice arenas maybe over amplified some of the sharper ways of dealing with this, and that's why I'm doing, in a way, why I feel my approach has merit, right? In other words, it's balance out the sense of what might be called for. It is not, though, to say that there aren't maybe some times when what we really need to do is to take a strong, maybe somewhat sharp stand. Mm-hmm. But I just think that really to do that requires a lot of skill and a lot of wisdom. Yeah. I mean, to act with sharpness, to do so in a way that doesn't itself lead to the kind of cycle of wounding, mm-hmm. right, and humiliation that really just keeps that churns our disconnects and churns a sense of separation. It takes a certain skill to act firmly and clearly, but to do so in a way that can minimize rather than exacerbate patterns of disconnect and separation. And so I think in general, I see a lot of fairly, frankly, unwise resort to these sharper ways of making a point. So I don't, not to point out or call out anyone in particular, but just to say, if we can invite a deeper reflection on what are the both intentions and impacts of our efforts in the arena of justice and of repair and ending oppression. You know, we certainly want to do what we can to end oppression, but in service of what? Like, what do we want? What do we want to create? Right. You know, that to me has to be an ongoing inquiry and reflection and a meditation. What is this all for? For me, it's never about just replacing, mm-hmm. right? Just changing places with the people or the process, whatever it is that I believe to have been causing harm. It's really about trying to bring about a new way of being with each other.
Right. It's not that you want to ascend into the oppressor's spot and oppress.
Exactly.
Right? Ideally, those systems would be dismantled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And dismantle in a way that really amounts to a kind of a level shift for humanity, mm-hmm. right? Where through which we can really attend to the call of this time, which is to find ways, I think, to live together on a planet where indeed everything is connected, and where, again, the consequences of not figuring out how to work more effectively together are real and in many ways dire. And so I really feel that, there's a certain kind of urgency to figuring out how to work for some notion of justice and to end oppression, but how to do that in a way that opens the heart and that expands the capacity of all of us to be agents of a kind of public love that can help us sustain human life. Because the rest of the planet, the universe is going to go on in whatever way, but human life is vulnerable right now because of, I think, our failure to figure out how to live more gently and effectively together on this planet, and to appreciate this brief opportunity we have between the birth and the death date, the expiration date, to make a positive impact on our world.
Do you ever lose your cool?
Not as much these days. but I do get upset. I mean, there's so much right now that, I mean, I do quote unquote lose my cool. I often lose my cool intentionally.
Oh, as a tool?
Well, not necessarily as a tool. Well, a tool for my own healing. In other words, if I need to let it out, and like if there is some heat that's building, like again, this is a trauma sensitive way of doing this work. Like if I'm feeling that sense of agitation and despair, or just like kind of some sudden kind of rage, like something I hear that just seems like completely nuts. I my own practice journey at the moment is about allowing those feelings to be expressed. And as much as possible, doing that regularly enough that they're not, creating a kind of a boiler that is going to explode out there, right? So if I'm here at home where it's safe, it's part of my practice to let the anger and the rage that I feel about injustice come right out. Mm-hmm. I just think that should be seen as, as good practice to let ourselves feel the entire range. And so that when we are, out and, again, in these privileged opportunities we have to be with each other, and something comes up and we are tempted to be triggered, we might have something to let go. We might have to, express some of that, but we're not expressing the week's worth or the month's worth.
Right.
And we have got to let out, right? Dropping it on the head of the, the person who broke the camel's back, right? Or the one comment.
Yeah.
So I think it's a kind of, we're not perfect. I'm not a machine. I regularly lose my cool, but I do it in a way that I think is in service of, kind of dealing with the sort of, I'm just going to call it like a trauma aware way of being, living mindfulness. It's like you can't. There's right now. There's so many things happening that are. If you are willing to look at these difficult issues, and if you're not seeing it, if you're not, your heart isn't breaking. Like for me, my heart is breaking every day in
all
some
day.
way. Yeah, absolutely, all day, every day. So I have to be careful. I hum, I sing more nowadays. I hum and sing with others more nowadays.
Really?
Because I think that's a full body kind of practice for letting our body's natural capacities to process traumatic events, and to allow emotions to be not just titrated, but kind of to be integrated, to be sort of right, the alchemy of it to work.
Yeah, right.
The whole body is in on that. So singing, holding hands, humming, all of these are sort of, it seems to me, ways that human beings across time and culture have managed to get through difficult times. I mean, we are not the first, obviously. Right. In fact, I forget sometimes how many generations of human beings before the recorded human history, right? Archaeologists and anthropologists tell us Homo sapiens sapiens, have been on the planet for a couple 100,000 years at a minimum. Mm-hmm. Homo sapiens sapiens. Now, we didn't record that history until much more recently. But just to think that for hundreds of thousands of years, we don't know the numbers of battles, rages, right? The despair, the inhumanity to each other. And yet we survived. And yet we didn't burn down the planet. And yet we figured out how to keep, getting up every day and feeding the children, so to speak. There is deep wisdom for how to move through difficult times like ours that we've forgotten so much of that. Mm-hmm. And so for me, mindfulness is an invitation for us to not simply, work the practices of this particular beautiful set of teachings that we call mindfulness, but through that awareness, recognize that there's a planet's worth of wisdom about how to get through difficult times, and about the holistic nature of what that takes. So that's what I'm about these days.
There are worse things to be about.
Yeah. So, we're humming at our Dharma talks these days, or we are, sometimes there might be a breaking out into song,
An incredible way to deal with it. Mm-hmm. I thought that losing your cool would look more like, I don't know, like, do you ever want to just swipe all those books off the bookcase behind you, or
and start over? Well, yeah. I mean, maybe, but not so much. I mean, I guess when I hear this, I'm thinking of, those who are tempted to say, we just really need to start all over again, right? We just could just blow it all up and start all over again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that we know there's a strain of that's in our political and social culture right now. And I just feel, I don't have kids, for example, I'm not physically a mother, but I kind of feel like most moms and most of us, again, in these communities that have suffered a lot over time, we're here. We're usually not the ones who say, let's burn it all down, because our children are in that. The things we have lovingly protected from the worst as best we could for generations, whether through slavery or through whatever, right, our cultures and heritages have suffered through. We suffered through so that we can live another day and find the sources of hope and regeneration. We could have at any time said, let's burn it all down like that. So I think that it's a certain kind of relative privilege that allows one to say, in response to times of great difficulty like we're in right now, well, let's just burn it all down. And I've heard someone say, well, yeah, humankind probably won't, the 7 billion won't survive, but, maybe 5 billion get sloughed off and the other 2 billion will be able, I'm like,
that's not okay.
This kind of cavalier attitude to 5 billion human beings, that, let's talk to the mothers in those amongst us, right? So I do think, and I don't want to privilege, women in a certain way, but I mean that mothering instinct. I believe it's in all of us on some level. That instinct that would protect, that would go into the fire and pull out what we can and start again. Yeah. That to me is, that mindfulness of that, cultivation of that is, I think, what I feel called to help support. And that, I think, it comes at least in part from my own particular lineage as the granddaughter of formerly enslaved people. There is a way that, even in the darkest times, intergenerationally dark times, mm-hmm. where there's no reason to think your children will ever get out of this. Yeah. There's a way, nevertheless, to love, to help bring about places where joy and healing can happen. And my goodness, if people could do it during much darker times, the Holocausts of our history, the enslavement periods of our history, if it could be done, then we can do it now. Mm-hmm. And, so I have some love and compassion for those who feel so beleaguered that the call is to just burn it down. I do. I understand that. And I say, before you light that match, look into the eyes of a child, hold the hand of a friend, realize that these very human gestures matter. Mm. Yeah. And, look for that will, that capacity to live another day in love.
Rhonda Magee and I in conversation from fall 2019. Rhonda's excellent book, The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Transforming Our Communities, is out now in paperback from Penguin Random House. You can read 2 excerpts from the book on mindful.org. We'll link to both in our show notes, and we'll link to the book itself as well. Now, if you enjoyed this episode of Real Mindful, would you leave us a review? You can find us wherever you find podcasts that you love to listen to, and your review helps other listeners decide whether to give Real Mindful a try. We'd love to hear from you, too. You can let us know what you thought of what you heard on the show, or suggest a topic or guest. Drop us a line at yourwords@mindful.org. I should let you know, too, that we also have a weekly practice podcast called 12-Minute Meditation. Neuroscientific research reveals that 12 minutes of meditation a day can be enough to yield some of the benefits we look for, like increased focus, clarity, calm, and compassion. And so each week we deliver a fresh mindfulness practice directly from your ears from a leading mindfulness expert so that you can do your 12-minute meditation with some expert direction. And you can subscribe to 12-Minute Meditation, again, wherever you find your favorite podcasts. We'll be back with another episode of Real Mindful in November. Until then, may all your pauses be mindful ones.